Thus, in mid-February and in the last decade of February, the crisis in the section of Army Group South reached the highest tension. At the same time, the danger of encircling the entire southern wing of the front as a result of a deep bypass from the neighbouring northern section. But just in this extreme aggravation of the situation hid the beginning of the turn. At first, however, the situation was still deteriorating. The planned reorganization of the Group B on the decisive section of the front just at this point meant, undoubtedly, danger. Although the command of this group had, in addition to the Second Army, only the remnants of broken units, it was still an essential link in the chain of associations operating on the Eastern Front. Excluding it would lead to a break in the front at the junction between the Group Centre and South. In practice, the South Group could not yet take over the section in the Kharkov area because there was no communication. While the transfer of command would have been possible, Kharkov would have already been lost. Only thanks to the excellent work of the group's communications regiment and the purposeful management of communications by our Chief of Communications, General Muller, was it possible to quickly transfer command in the Kharkov area. As always, in this, my friend, the commander of the liaison troops, General Feldjebel, helped me a lot. Although the elimination of the Group B at first made it difficult for the overall coordinated management of operations on the most difficult section of the Eastern Front, it still brought its own benefit. As a result of the subordination of Lanz's group to the Group South created the opportunity to organize a unified management of operations at the crucial moment in the decisive area. This just helped to successfully finish the winter campaign of 1942/43. At first, the Kharkov area gave Group South only new worries, although for a few days Group B itself led operations in the area. Lanz's group received orders from Hitler to hold Kharkov at all costs, the loss of which could affect Germany's prestige as a kind of new Stalingrad. In addition, Lanz's group with the SS Panzer Corps, which formed the core of this group, but which still consisted of 2 instead of 3 divisions, was to break through to Lozovaya to alleviate the situation of the left flank of the Group South. Naturally, Lanz's group could accomplish only one of these tasks with its own forces. It could either fight for Kharkov or attack on the left flank of the Group South. I therefore suggested to Hitler that Lanz's group should first of all abandon Kharkov and try to defeat the enemy south of Kharkov. This would prevent the danger of bypassing the group across the Dnieper on both sides of Kremenchug. We hoped to cope ourselves with the enemy, who aimed his attack on the crossings of the Dnieper at Zaporozhye and Dnepropetrovsk by the introduction of the 4th Tank Army into the battle. If Lanz had broken the enemy south of Kharkov, then he could turn to Kharkov and retake it. But such a decision was not in accordance with the plans of Hitler, for whom Kharkov, the capital of Ukraine, had already become a matter of prestige. He gave, therefore, on February 13th once again strict orders to Lanz's group to hold Kharkov under all circumstances. I therefore asked the Oak whether this order remained valid even after Lanz had passed into my command, including in case of danger of encirclement of the SS Tank Corps in Kharkov. At the same time, I asked for a reply to my letter assessing the general situation, which I had sent the day before to Letzen. General Zeitzler answered me that Hitler had said about my letter that I was looking too far ahead, but I answered him that I thought it was right if the group headquarters planned actions 4 to 8 weeks ahead, and I doubted whether the High Command was doing the right thing when it thought only 3 days ahead. As for the situation at Kharkov, circumstances were stronger than Hitler's wishes. SS Tank Corps, which was already in danger of encirclement in Kharkov, retreated on February 15th, however, contrary to the order of General Lanz from the city. We were informed of this fact by the headquarters of Group B, which was in the process of liquidation. If Kharkov had been left on the orders of any army general, Hitler would undoubtedly have brought him to a court-martial. But since it was the SS Panzer Corps, which acting, however, quite correctly avoided encirclement, this did not happen. It is true that the commander of the Group Lanz a few days later was replaced by General Kempf of the armoured forces under the pretext that General Lanz belonged to the mountain rifle troops, and Kempf was a tanker. While during the transfer of command in the Kharkov area from Group B to Group South the situation there became noticeably more acute, at the same time created an acute danger for the group, which could be cut off from its communications across the Dnieper. On February 16th, it was reported that the enemy, as we had long expected, began a major offensive from the area west of Izium in the direction of Pavlograd and Dnepropetrovsk. If the enemy managed to reach the railroad junction of Lozovaya or Pavlograd here, the railroad connection through Poltava would be cut. At the same time, the pace of delivery of the replenishment promised to us by the OK weakened again. Instead of the promised 37 transports, only 6 arrived daily on February 14th. Further, the command of the group center stated that the group did not have enough forces to do anything substantial to interact with the group south in the breakthrough area between the two groups. It would apparently be pleased if it could stop the Second Army retreating in the area of the arc protruding far to the west-west of Kursk. The situation became so critical that Hitler decided to come to my headquarters. My repeated reports with an assessment of the situation forced him, apparently, to think. As much as I welcomed the opportunity to report to him personally my thoughts, as well as the fact that he could personally see the seriousness of the situation, yet, of course, it was difficult to ensure the safety of his stay in a large industrial city such as Zaporozhye. Besides, he informed me that he would be staying for several days. He was accommodated in our office together with his entourage, which included the Chief of the General Staff and General Jodl. The entire surrounding area had to be hermetically sealed off. Still, the situation could not be considered safe, because Hitler's arrival was not a secret, and at the entrance from the airfield to the city he was recognized and welcomed by the soldiers who were in Zaporozhye, representatives of his party and others. For protection we had in Zaporozhye, except for our guard company, only a few anti-aircraft units. In the near future, enemy tanks were to come so close to the city that they could shell the airfield located east of the Dnieper. February 17th in the evening, Hitler arrived at my headquarters. I reported to him first the situation. Golits's group reached this day the boundary of the Mayas, although the enemy strongly pressed it. One tank army stopped the enemy at Grishino, but could not yet break him. The battle in the Kramatorsk area against enemy units advancing from the Lysychansk-Slaviansk line has not yet been successful. Lance's group, as I said, left Kharkov and retreated southwest to the Moj River. Then I reported to Hitler my plan to release the SS Tank Corps at Kharkov and leave in this area only the remaining formations of the group Lance. The SS Tank Corps should, according to my plan, to advance from the area of Krasnograd to the southeast in the general direction of Pavlograd and organize interaction with the approaching here 4-tank army. These units were to break the enemy advancing in a wide gap between the 1st Tank Army and Lance's group. If this would have succeeded, thereby eliminating the danger of cutting off the group Golit and 1 tank army, and then we could strike in the area of Kharkov. Hitler at first refused to discuss my planned operations in the order I proposed. He did not want to believe that in the area between the 1st Panzer Army and Lance's group attacked really large enemy forces. He was afraid that the troops that would take part in my planned operation in the area between the Dnieper and the Donets would get stuck in the mud. As spring was already approaching, such a possibility existed. But the main reason for Hitler's rejection of this plan was his desire to return Kharkov as quickly as possible, by all means, which he hoped to do when the SS Panzer Corps would be fully staffed. In fact, the situation was such that a strike in the direction of Kharkov presupposed the prior elimination of the danger to crossings across the Dnieper. Without secured crossings across the Dnieper, the 1st Tank Army and Golits's group would be unviable. In addition, the strike on Kharkov required the participation of at least part of the forces of the 4th Panzer Army. Finally, it was clear that in case the Thaw suspended operations, it should happen earlier in the area between the Donets and the Dnieper, rather than in the Kharkov area and north of it. It was hoped that after the defeat of the enemy advancing between the 1st Tank Army and the Lance Group, it would be possible to strike at Kharkov. On the other hand, it was more than doubtful whether it would be possible to carry out the first operation only after the second. In this case, even after the victory at Kharkov, the connection of the right flank and the centre of the group along the Dnieper could be cut a position that could not be sustained during a long period of thawing, lasting several weeks. The persistence with which Hitler always defended his opinion naturally led again to an endless discussion. I put an end to this discussion by saying that the SS Panzer Corps should in any case first be concentrated on the Kharkov-Krasnograd highway. This could be done at the earliest on February 19th. Therefore, only then could it be finally decided whether to march north or south. This postponement of the decision of the question was successful for me thanks to my argument that until February 19th, you cannot count on the 4th Tank Army. I obviously also correctly believed that the course of events, which now Hitler himself closely observed, will force him to agree with me. February 18th. I again reported to Hitler. The enemy was advancing in large forces at the boundary of the Meuse. In many places he broke through the not yet fortified positions of the Group Gollet. We also have not yet managed to destroy the enemy cavalry corps encircled behind this front at Debaltsevo. I reported to Hitler that, despite this, there is still an urgent need to withdraw the motorized units from this flank to the western flank, although this is not possible at the moment. The enemy mechanized corps located at Grishino Deep in the flank of the 1st Tank Army has also not yet been destroyed, and our forces operating there have not yet been relieved. We had already received, however, irrefutable data that in the gap between the 1st Tank Army and the Lance Group the enemy was indeed advancing in large forces to the Dnieper crossings. The enemy's 267th SDN was noted south of Krasnograd, with the forces of the 35th Guards Division, which included a tank battalion, the enemy occupied Pavlograd. One Italian division, which was there, quickly left the city as the enemy approached. Lance's group reported that the motorized units of the SS Totenkopf Panzer Division unloaded in Kiev were stuck in the mud between Kiev and Poltava. A strike northward to seize Kharkov, which Hitler had so persistently planned, was now impossible. If the SS Panzer Corps, without the Totenkopf Division, could not hold Kharkov, then without a division whose combat readiness could not be foreseen, it was even less able to retake it. It was now possible to plan only a strike to the southeast in order to destroy the enemy advancing in the gap between the Lance Group and the 1st Tank Army. But since there, too, we had to soon expect the thaw, we had to hurry. In these circumstances, Hitler agreed with my opinion to send from the SS Panzer Corps Motorized Infantry Division Reich, which was the easiest to release, to Pavlograd. The Division Leib Standart was to cover the operations of the 4th Army against the enemy advancing from Kharkov in a southerly direction. It was hoped that the 4th Tank Army, reinforced by the Reich Division, would succeed. After this decision was made, I reported to Hitler my opinion of the general situation. Even if we manage, which was not very likely to avoid unfavourable for us before the onset of thaw, we must think about the future. The thaw and mud will not give us a respite for more than a few weeks. The group will have to hold a front 700 kilometres wide, on which we have 32 divisions, including parts of the Group Lance. The enemy, as it was safe to assume, after the thaw will again choose the main direction of its operations, the southern wing of the Eastern Front, in order to encircle it near the Black Sea. Front of 700 km, defended by only 30 divisions, can be broken by superior enemy forces in any area, but above all, we could not prevent the enemy to bypass our group from the north and continue this game until he will not finish it at the Azov or Black Sea. After the end of the thaw period, the group therefore cannot stand still to wait where the enemy will make a breakthrough or until he bypasses us from the north. This is possible only if the OK can offensively relieve the situation on our front projecting far to the east. With my arguments, I intended to encourage Hitler from the operational point of view to look somewhat ahead. But it was obvious that Hitler did not want to make any commitments. He agreed that the forces of the group is weak to organize the defense of the front in the current year. On the other hand, he did not want to recognize the figures I cited about the balance of forces. In fact, he did not dispute that there are 341 enemy formations against us, but stated that their combat effectiveness is low. To my objection that the forces of our divisions were running out, he replied that during the thaw they would be replenished with personnel and new weapons. But he did not want to admit that the enemy would call up, during this time the 1926, contingent of 1.5 million men for military service. He also did not want to recognize that, during the period of thawing, the enemy's tank industry could re-equip 60 tank brigades in 2 months. On the contrary, he emphasized the decisive importance of the Donbass for the enemy's tank industry, in case it fell into his hands again. As for the direction of operations in 1944 on the Eastern Front, he cannot for a major offensive withdraw forces from other theatres and cannot create new formations. But limited strikes using new weapons would be possible. Thus Hitler was once again on his horse weapons and their production, and it was no longer possible to get him to outline operational plans for the summer campaign. We apparently lived in different worlds. February 19th, there was a new conversation, to which Field Marshal von Kleist was also invited. All the same, during his stay in my headquarters, Hitler more clearly understood the danger of the situation on the southern flank. He said that now the Gruppe must give everything they can, the Group South. Gruppe should be considered now as the closest reservoir of forces of the front of the Group South. Thus he put under the Spud plans for the operational use of the bridgehead on the Kuban. Unfortunately, time then showed that the nearest reserve of forces did not give them to us even to the extent that was possible if they were transferred through the Crimea. The Kuban bridgehead had to continue to live its own life. Old experience tells us that nothing is more difficult than to release forces that were once left on an unnecessary site. Otherwise, this day brought further aggravation of the situation, after the enemy, apparently in large forces, seized the railway station Sinikovo. Thus he not only cut the main communication of the group centre and the right flank of our group, but stood already 60 km from our headquarters, which was the Führer of the Third Empire. Not a single unit was between us and our enemy. I was therefore very reassured when Hitler flew to his headquarters on the evening of that day. One could well expect that the next day enemy tanks would make it impossible to use the airfield east of the Dnieper. As a final matter, I reported to Hitler that almost all the panzer divisions I need for the planned strikes on the western flank of the group, therefore they must be removed from the boundary of the Mayas. If we have held so far this front, it is only because the bulk of the forces of the enemy advancing here had to pass through a narrow corridor near Rostov, and therefore could not yet reach it. There was a possibility of the enemy taking Donbass from the east. We could prevent this danger only if we could eliminate the threat of cutting off our group from its rear communications. This seems to have been understood by Hitler as well. In any case, I have the impression that his visit to my headquarters helped him to understand the now looming danger of encirclement, which threatens in the future the entire southern wing of the Eastern Front. OKW, or General Schmundt, was soon launched a version that Hitler was supposedly at our place in order to raise the morale of the group. I did not think we needed such a morale boost at that time. If we were not going as Hitler demanded, however, to cling stubbornly to every inch of ground, without regard to what consequences this holding at all costs would have, I believe that it would not have been easy to find another headquarters like ours, which would have shown such a stubborn will to win. In this sense, we never had any disagreement between myself and my officers. On February 19th, the Army Group issued an order to move the 4th Tank Army in a counter-offensive against the enemy, striking through the line Pereshapino-Pavlograd-Grishino in order to cut off the group from the Dnieper. On February 20th, the nearest operational plans of the enemy, corresponding to what we had foreseen, became quite clear. On the Eastern Front, the enemy was advancing on the Mias frontier occupied by the Task Force Golet, having outlined 3 directions of the main blow, on which he was going to make a breakthrough. To cut off our communications across the Dnieper, he introduced, in addition to the units stopped by us at Grishin and Kramatorsk, apparently one army consisting of 3 rifle divisions, 2 tank corps and cavalry. At the same time, he tried to break through the weak front of Kempf's group southwest and west of Kharkov. In the future, he sought to cover this group on its northwestern flank, and at the same time to realize a deep bypass of it from the north. Our group was to fulfill 2 tasks. It was to try to hold the eastern section of the Mayas. It was impossible to say whether this task was feasible for this section of the front in the presence of such a small force, and due to the lack of reserves, especially tank divisions. Further, the 4th Tank Army had to quickly defeat the enemy in the gap between the 1st Tank Army and Kempf's group, and thus prevent the group from being cut off from crossing the Dnieper. Otherwise, due to lack of fuel, the bulk of the force was soon to become unable to move. If it was possible to break the enemy group between the Donets and the Dnieper, from which it sought to cut us off, the situation would show whether we could immediately move all mobile forces to the north to restore the situation created in Kempf's group. Maybe it would be necessary to first still introduce the 4th Tank Army in the area of operations of the 1st Tank Army, if the latter would not have coped by this time with their own forces with the enemy at Grishino and Kramatos. In any case, we had to abandon the actions on our northern flank, that is, in the area of operations of Kempf's group. This group could fulfill only one task to block the enemy's way to the Dnieper, either through Krasnograd or Dnepropetrovsk, or through Poltava or Kremenchug. If the enemy had dared to go to Kiev, as evidenced by some signs, we could only wish him a happy journey. The time for the success of such a deep bypass before the onset of the thaw was already lost. The day of February 21st brought the first signs of relief on the main sections of the front. The eastern section along the Mayas held. The remnants of the enemy cavalry corps, which had long been surrounded behind the front line at Debaltsevo, were finally forced to surrender. The enemy tank corps that had broken through the positions on the Mayas near Matveev-Kurgan was also surrounded, and there were battles to destroy it. On the right flank of the 1st Tank Army, the enemy continued to put pressure on Freta's group, clearly with the intention of breaking the defences on the Mayas, or destroy the troops in the northern section of the 1st Tank Army. In front of this army, the enemy behaved calmly. Intercepted radiograms said that the enemy group, fighting in front of the western section of the 1st Tank Army at Grishino and in the area of Kramatorsk, experienced difficulties. Apparently, it was a bad thing with transportation. The 4th Tank Army occupied Pavlograd. We could hope that its last units would arrive before the beginning of the thaw. It was no longer a big danger for us that one small tank group of the enemy approached Zaporozhye. It stopped 20 kilometers from the city due to lack of fuel, and we managed to subsequently dismember it into small groups and destroy it. Unfortunately, the new division coming to us, which was going to Pavlograd, was turned by OK to the right flank of the group centre, to Sumy. If the situation in the 2nd Army was not particularly good, the main thing now was that we were finally on the way to seize the initiative. In comparison with this, it would not be so important if during this time the enemy had somewhat advanced in the direction to Kiev and north of it. Such plans of the enemy were clear from the fact that his large forces were approaching from Belgorod to Akhturka, evidently with the purpose of bypassing Kempf's group from the north. The next few days brought the expected success counterattack of the 4th Tank Army, and the initiative in this campaign finally again passed to us. First, the army defeated the enemy forces advancing on the Dnieper crossings, that is, the grouping in the area of Pavlograd and south of it. What Hitler did not want to agree with confirmed there were 2 enemy tank corps, 1 rifle corps and 1 cavalry corps. Then we managed in cooperation with the 1 Tank Army to defeat 4 enemy tank and mechanized corps facing its western front. By March 1st, it became clear that the Russians, due to their defeat in the area between the Donets and Dnieper and in front of the northern front of 1 Tank Army, weakened their resistance, and that our army will again be able to seize the frontier along the Donets. It was tempting to follow the enemy through the Donets, which was still frozen with ice, in order to get into his rear near Kharkov and west of it. First, however, it was necessary to break the southern flank of the Kharkov group of the enemy, whose large forces stood southwest of Kharkov, on Berestovaya, to free their hands for the offensive through the Middle Donets. Whether this was possible in view of the coming soon period of thaw was more than doubtful. Therefore, the group had to first be satisfied to meet the Kharkov grouping of the enemy west of the Donets and break it there. In the southern coastal area of the group's operations had already begun to thaw. Therefore, at the end of February, the enemy at the boundary of the Mayas began to enter the breakthrough areas instead of tank and mobile formations of infantry divisions. The enemy clearly intended to seize the bridgeheads west of the Mayas before the onset of the thawing period. After his offensive on a broad front in this area failed, it turned into a series of unsuccessful local attacks. On March 2nd, the group could already reveal the results of its first counterattack, conducted by it with the forces of the 4th Tank Army and the left flank of the 1st Tank Army, on the enemy grouping located between the Donets and the Dnieper. As a result of this strike, as well as the successful defense of the Golit group on the Mayas, the enemy armies of the southwestern front were so badly damaged that they were no longer capable of attacking. Especially weakened the onslaught of enemy units advancing on the left flank of the 1st Tank Army, and in the junction between it and Kempf's group, the enemy's 6th Army, Popov's group operating at Grishino, and the 1st Guards Army. It could be assumed that we destroyed 25 TK and 3 rifle divisions, defeated 3 TK and 4 GV, TK, 10 TK, 1 separate tank brigade, 1 mechanized brigade, 1 rifle division, and 1 ski brigade. Significant losses were suffered by 1 GV, TK and 18 TK, 6 rifle divisions, and 2 ski brigades. According to the reports of our troops, the enemy in this battle between Donetsk and Dnieper lost 2-3, 000 killed. We captured 615 tanks, 354 guns, 69 anti-aircraft guns, and a large number of machine guns and mortars. The prisoners, however, were few 9,000. This is because our troops, mainly tank divisions, were unable to create a tight ring around the enemy. The cold forced especially at night to settle in and around populated areas, so that for the enemy soldiers and his units that abandoned their vehicles, there was enough space to get out of the encirclement. But we were not able to cut the Donets in the rear of the enemy, because the river was still ice-covered, and it was easily overcome by soldiers with light weapons. In addition to the mentioned enemy formations, we destroyed the 4 GV, MK and 7 GV, KK encircled behind the Maas border. After, as a result of this victory between the Donetsk and the Dnieper, the initiative was again in our hands, the group, according to the order given on February 28th, began an offensive on the Voronezh front of the enemy, that is, on his troops located in the area of Kharkov. We intended to strike at the southern flank of the enemy to squeeze him from the south, or, if it turns out possible later, to hit him in the rear from the east. Our goal was not to seize Kharkov, but to defeat and, if possible, destroy the enemy units located there. The closest objective, therefore, was the defeat of the enemy's southern flank, located on Berestovaya southwest of Kharkov, on which the 3rd Soviet Tank Army was operating. This objective was achieved by the 4th Tank Army by March 5th. Of the enemy's 3 Tank Army, 12 and 4 TK, 1 Cavalry Corps, and 3 rifle divisions were partially defeated. Some of their personnel were taken prisoner in a small cauldron near Krasnograd. Again, there were relatively few prisoners. The enemy lost about 12,000 men killed. We captured 61 tanks, 225 guns, and 600 vehicles. However, due to weather conditions, was now unfeasible our goal to get in the rear of the enemy, pressing Kempf's group in the direction of Aktyrka and Poltava, and force him to take the fight with an inverted front. To do this, the 4th Tank Army had to cross the Donets below Kharkov, so that then, turning to the west, to come behind the enemy from the east. But at this time the ice on the Donets began to fail. Soon the ice drift was to begin, which made it impossible to flood the pontoon bridges. It was hardly possible, due to the thaw, even to bypass the enemy in a small area by crossing the Mosh southwest of Kharkov in order to take the city from the rear, through which the rear communications of the enemy went. We tried therefore to attack the enemy in the flank and push him away from Kharkov. In accordance with this plan, the 4th Panzer Army, including the SS Panzer Corps, the last division of which, Division Totenkopf, had already fully arrived, on March 7th began an offensive from the area of Krasnograd to the north. Kempf's group joined this offensive as soon as the enemy forces on its front began to weaken. The offensive of the 4th Tank Army and the SS Tank Corps proceeded well in the following days. We managed to attack a number of enemy formations from the flank and defeat them. Now the enemy also realized the danger threatening his Voronezh front. Radio reconnaissance established that the enemy was apparently transferring several tank and mechanized corps from the area of Voroshilovgrad to Izium, in order to apparently throw them into the flank of the 4th Tank Army, advancing from the north to Kharkov. However, these units failed to launch an offensive on a large scale. This happened either because these units, as a result of previous fighting in the area of Voroshilovgrad or on the Mias frontier, were no longer able to launch an offensive, or because their advance was prevented by the opening of the Donets. The enemy was able to seize and hold only a small bridgehead northwest of Izium on the south bank of the Donets. Then the enemy drove from the east 2 GV, TK to Kharkov, and drove from the west to Bogodokov units that were pressing the northern flank of Kempf's group and 2 Army. Since the 2nd Army was too weak to launch an offensive, it was doubtful whether we would be able to prevent the retreat to the east of the enemy, who was advancing in the direction of Aktyrka and north of it, and advanced far to the west. In any case, we wanted to push back from Kharkov the enemy, who stood to the south, against Kemp's group, or cut him off from the crossings across the Donets east of Kharkov. If we had succeeded, we could have taken Kharkov by storm. The group, under all circumstances, intended to avoid a repetition of the fighting at Stalingrad, where the attacks of our forces smothered on the outskirts of the city. But it was inevitable that the word Kharkov magically attracted soldiers and the middle ranks of the army leadership. The SS Tank Corps wanted to present the newly conquered capital of Ukraine to its Führer as a sign of victory, and was making its way to him by the shortest possible route. It took a sharp intervention of the group command to achieve the refusal of the Corps command from the intention to frontally attack Kharkov, otherwise it would be stuck here, and thus would give the enemy units operating to the west of the city to avoid encirclement. Finally, it was possible to send the SS Panzer Corps to bypass Kharkov from the east. The city fell without major fighting, and we were able to cut off the retreat across the Donets' large enemy forces. The situation in the area of Kharkov and south of it forced the enemy first, as already mentioned, to weaken, and then withdraw in the direction of Kharkov-Belgorod their units facing Kemp's group, already approaching Poltava, and took north of it Oktyabrsky. March 10th, Hitler again visited our headquarters. I reported to him, in addition to the situation, our plans regarding the conduct of operations after the end of the period of thaw that is now beginning. I will talk about this in the next chapter. On March 14th, the SS Panzer Corps captured Kharkov. At the same time, on the northern flank of Kemp's group, the Grossdeutschland division was rapidly advancing on Belgorod. The enemy threw against it large forces of tanks, which the division, however, broke at Gaivoron, then began the offensive on Belgorod. The capture of Kharkov and Belgorod ended the second counterattack of our group. The increasing thaw excluded further operations. Actually, the group had one more goal as the final phase of the operation, together with Army Group Center, to clear from the enemy arc near Kursk, cutting deep to the west into the German front, and create here a shorter front. But we had to abandon this intention, because the Group Center said that it cannot participate in this operation. So this arc remained an unpleasant protrusion on our front, which opened to the enemy certain operational opportunities and at the same time limited our capabilities. Our group still firmly held the entire front along the Donets from Belgorod to the point where the Mayas branch, and along the latter. This was the same line on which the German troops stood in the winter of 1941-42. If in conclusion to make a brief review of the course of battles and events of this winter campaign of 1942-43 in southern Russia, then first of all it is necessary to note, undoubtedly, the great success of the Soviet troops. The Soviets managed to encircle an entire army, the strongest being the Sixth Army, and to destroy it. In addition, the Soviets wiped off the face of the earth 4 Allied armies fighting on the side of the German forces. Many brave soldiers who were also in these armies were killed. A considerable part of them were taken prisoner by the Soviets. The remnants of these armies disintegrated and had to be sooner or later removed from the front. As a combat-ready force at the front, they were already lost. Although most of the divisions of the Sixth Army were reformed from remnants and replenishments, and Gollitz's group in March 1944 was named the Sixth Army, we still definitively lost the bulk of the soldiers of almost 20 divisions and a significant part of the artillery and engineering units of the RGK. Although the actual combat capability of the Allied armies was only limited, still their withdrawal from service was a significant loss for us. As a result, we were deprived of the opportunity to release German forces, at least on the quiet parts of the front. Despite the fact that the German army lost almost 5 armies, still it could not be said that these losses were decisive for the outcome of the war. To the loss of troops, we must also add the Russian mastery of all the huge territory with its resources captured by us as a result of the summer offensive of 1942. We failed to capture Caucasian oil, which was one of the main goals of our offensive. It should be noted, however, that this military economic goal, on which Goering especially insisted, was decisive for the fact that the German summer offensive was fragmented. Chasing this territorial goal forgot that any achievement and retention of such a goal must precede the defeat of the main forces of the enemy. However, we managed to hold a significant part of Donbass, which was an important factor for the conduct of the war. However great the Soviet gains, they still failed to achieve the decisive victory on the southern flank of the Eastern Front, the destruction of that southern flank, which we probably could not compensate for in any way. At the end of the winter campaign, the initiative was once again with us. In this winter campaign, we inflicted 2 defeats on the Soviets. These victories were not, however, decisive, but they enabled us to stabilize the front and opened before us the prospect of continuing the war in the east with a view to achieving a draw. We could no longer doubt that our hopes for a decisive offensive in the summer of 1944 were buried. In addition, we had very heavy losses in manpower. It was clear that the High Command had to conclude from these events that it was necessary to endeavour by all means to reach an agreement with at least one of the adversaries. Equally, it had to realize that the war in the East could now be waged only with the aim of exhausting the Russian offensive power while at the same time preserving its own forces, especially avoiding the loss of entire armies, as was the case at Stalingrad. It had to do this by decisively abandoning all secondary objectives and making the war in the Eastern theatre of operations its main objective, since the Western opponents were not yet in a position to land in France or to strike a decisive blow from the Mediterranean area. If after these remarks we turn to the winter campaign of 1942/43 and its results, we must ask the question, why did the Soviet command achieve in this winter campaign great successes, but not the decisive success, the destruction of the entire southern wing of the German army? After all, it had in its hands the strongest trump cards imaginable, the overwhelming superiority in the number of formations and the above-described favourable operational situation at the beginning of the campaign. It should be said that the Soviet command acted quite vigorously. To achieve its goals, it threw units into battle without regard to possible losses. Russian troops always fought bravely, and sometimes made incredible sacrifices. It is true that the quality of Russian infantry has significantly decreased. The army was not yet fully equipped with artillery after the losses of 1941. It is also undeniable that the Soviet command has learned a lot since the beginning of the war, especially with regard to the organization and use of large tank formations. It had a large number of tanks also in 1941, but then it could not use them independently and at the same time in unified formations. Now it expediently organized them into tank and mechanized corps, and at the same time adopted the German tactics of deep breakthrough. It is true that, with the exception of November 1942, we almost always managed to break or destroy these tank and mechanized formations, although sometimes deep in the rear. On the other hand, after the encirclement of the Sixth Army, they could no longer quickly and with large forces to carry out a breakthrough in decisive areas, so they were unable to achieve their goal of cutting off the southern wing of the German army on the Don, on the coast of the Sea of Azov, or on the lower Dnieper. The Soviet command could not, with the exception of Stalingrad, where they were helped by Hitler to realize the encirclement of large forces, while since 1941 we have done it many times, capturing many hundreds of thousands of prisoners. It could not do this, although it had an overwhelming superiority in the number of troops, and the favorable operational situation and the withdrawal of the Allied armies opened the way for the enemy to the rear of the German front. We, on the other hand, in 1941, generally speaking, had to fight a frontal battle on the Eastern Front. These conclusions can be reached by considering the actions of the Soviet Army High Command. It was impossible not to notice that in the operational situation after the end of the German summer offensive, it clearly had a definite strategic goal to encircle the entire German southern flank. The offensive on the fronts of our Allied armies from this point of view was self-evident. It thus did not require much genius to create a Soviet operational plan in the late fall of 1942. The decision for the first strike, the encirclement of the Sixth Army, was certainly the right one. If this plan succeeded and the German High Command was doing everything it could to succeed, the largest striking force of the German army would be eliminated. It would have been better together with this first strike to conduct a simultaneous offensive in the areas of the Italian and Hungarian armies, so that as a result of a broad single offensive operation from the beginning to try to cut off the German units at Rostov or the Sea of Azov. Obviously, there was not enough artillery available for this purpose. Therefore, the Soviet command planned breakthroughs one by one. Maybe, transportation did not allow to carry out simultaneous transfer and supply of all advancing forces. Still, the unexpectedly rapid and complete withdrawal of the Allied armies on the German front greatly compensated the Soviets for the disadvantages of this alternation in the timing of the three breakthroughs. And if, in spite of this, the Soviet command failed to achieve that close objective of cutting off the German southern flank on the lower Don, at the Sea of Azov, or eventually at the Dnieper, the reason was not that their offensive was over a large area. The distances to the most important points which the Soviet strike groups had to pass were not very great if we consider the possibilities of modern warfare. The German reserves that could be thrown into the battle were not strong enough to stop the Soviet offensive, which was destined to end in a serious defeat of the Russians before the decisive objective. Moreover, it must be said that the Soviet command was unable, with the exception of Stalingrad, to concentrate large and at the same time sufficiently mobile forces in decisive areas. In the first phase of the winter campaign, it undoubtedly concentrated superior forces against the Sixth Army in order not to let this prey out of its hands. But because of this, it missed the opportunity to cut the communications of the German southern flank on the lower Don. The forces operating on the Chira front were large, but lacked a unified plan of action. After the breakthrough of the front of the Italian army, the Soviet command also failed to throw all the forces to force the Donets and exit to Rostov. Of course, it feared that in such a blow with far-reaching goals its troops would be attacked from the flank. From this blow it could secure itself by its subsequent offensive on the Hungarian front. Of course, this is a risk, but without such a risk it was impossible to achieve decisive success quickly, which in this case was the main thing. But even after the successful breakthrough of the Hungarian army front, which created a gap in the German front from the Donets to Voronezh, the Soviet command could not organize a quick and strong enough breakthrough in the decisive direction, namely, to the Dnieper crossings. Instead of throwing all forces to achieve this success and being satisfied with covering the offensive from the west with one concentrated strike group, it dispersed its forces, striking in different directions through Kursk to Aktyrka, Poltava, to the Dnieper, and along the Donets line at Slavyansk, Lysychansk, Voroshilovgrad. This gave the German command the opportunity to create, in the end, superior forces in the decisive areas through the transfer of forces from the eastern flank to the western flank and the receipt of reinforcements. So far, the German army has managed to get out of the loop in time, although too long holding the Caucasus front and the slow withdrawal of Group A gave the enemy chances to defeat us. Schlieffen once said that in achieving military success in battle and campaign contribute to both parties, the victor and the vanquished. Above, I have clearly characterized the participation of the German High Command in the loss of the Sixth Army and in general in the crisis on the southern wing of the Eastern Front, which emerged in the winter of 1942/43. Therefore, justice requires to characterize also the participation that the German army took in the last success in the disruption of the encirclement of the German southern flank. Only one thing can be said about it: Army Group could not have ultimately defeated the enemy if the German troops and their commanders had not made an almost inhuman effort in this winter campaign, if our brave infantry divisions had not fought back against far superior enemy forces, if our infantry, despite the weak anti-tank defences in contrast to the Allied troops, would not have held firmly against enemy tank attacks, closing the front after the breakthrough of enemy tanks, and thus helping to destroy them. Nor would it have been possible to successfully lead this winter campaign if not for our tank divisions, which fought with incredible maneuverability, striking today here and tomorrow there, and thus multiplied the effect of their actions. The German army, always feeling its superiority over the enemy, withstood severe crises, and by its bravery and sacrifice nullified the numerical superiority of the enemy. But we cannot forget one more thing: the Sixth Army, by its devotion to duty and fighting to the end, knocked the palm of victory out of the hands of the enemy, did not let him defeat the southern wing of the German Eastern Front. If it had not resisted until the beginning of February, and surrendered as soon as the situation became hopeless, the enemy would then be able to throw into the battle in the decisive areas of large forces and could, in all likelihood, succeed in encircling the German southern flank. Therefore, the Sixth Army, with its unwavering steadfastness, until the last moment decisively contributed to the stabilization of the situation on the Eastern Front in March 1944. And if the sacrifice made then by the soldiers of the Sixth Army was in vain to decide the outcome of the war, this does not diminish its moral value. Therefore, at the end of this chapter on the winter campaign, let the name of the Sixth Army shine once again in the ages. It did the greatest thing that can be demanded of a soldier. It fought for its comrades in a hopeless situation to the last bullet. The spring of 1943 presented the German High Command with a difficult decision. The two campaigns we conducted did not lead to the defeat of the Soviet Union. I will not say here to what extent Hitler's political and strategic errors were to blame, nor will I consider whether, even with sound political aims and impeccable strategic leadership, the German armed forces would have been sufficient to achieve our goal of defeating the Soviet Union. He was standing on the very edge of the abyss. It now seems that the time has passed when Germany had the opportunity to finish off the Eastern enemy before launching a decisive offensive in the West. Since the landing of the Americans in North Africa, our end could already be foreseen there, and the opening of a second front on the European continent thus became perilously close. Now, not only the question of forces but also the time factor became decisive for the war in the East. We no longer had the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against our Western adversaries after Hitler had prematurely abandoned the invasion of England to turn against the Soviet Union. The Allies' statement at Casablanca, however, left no doubt about their desire to destroy not only Hitler and his regime but Germany in general. If we had any prospect of peace with the Western powers, it was probably only if we succeeded in repelling the invasion expected from their side or defeating them on the continent after the initial success of the invading forces. But these two possibilities involved the release of German forces in the East. The first question to be answered was whether we could at that time even reach a solution acceptable to us in the East, certainly not in terms of a complete defeat of the Soviet Union. It was a question of whether there was no possibility of achieving a draw. This solution meant for Germany the prospect of holding out as a state. It is now said that the idea of a draw result in the East was only a dream already in 1944. We will not now talk about whether this was really the case. We soldiers could not judge whether, from a political point of view in the spring of 1944, the possibility existed of reaching an agreement with the Soviet Union. If Hitler had been willing to do so, such a possibility was probably not entirely out of the question. But the command of the Don Group was convinced that from a military point of view, with the right operational leadership, such a draw in the East could be achieved. After all, the route from Stalingrad to the Donets required great sacrifices from the enemy. At the end of this campaign, he suffered two heavy defeats. The enemy did not achieve its goal, the encirclement of the entire German southern flank, for which there were all the prerequisites. At the end of the winter campaign, the initiative again passed to the German side. In all the winter battles, the German troops and their leadership again showed their higher qualities. No matter how expensive Stalingrad cost us, according to reliable calculations of the Oak, the enemy since the beginning of the war lost prisoners, killed and no longer able to carry out combat duty, has already lost 11 million people. The Russian offensive forces must eventually run out. So, at any rate, we considered at that time in our headquarters the military situation in the East. In this, of course, played a role in the fact that we managed to win the palm of victory in an almost hopeless situation at the end of the campaign. It was hardly necessary for us to assert, in the manner of many belated critics, that the war would in any case be lost. We had an enemy before us, and our task was to stop him before the borders of Germany. This enemy could be forced to accept a draw only by a series of blows. On the other hand, we had heard of the declaration at Casablanca, which gave us only one choice to achieve in the East, at least a balance of power. The next question was how we were to conduct operations in the East in 1944. For an offensive with far-reaching objectives, as we had done in previous years, our forces in comparison with those of the enemy were insufficient. Inevitably, it seems, we now had to resort to defense. If the Soviets intended to drive us out of their country, let them themselves bear the toil and loss in an offensive in which they might bleed to death. Of course, we were very much buoyed by the idea to use defensive tactics as the most durable kind of combat. For two considerations, however, we could only adopt defense on a limited scale. The first consideration. In the spring of 1944, No one could say whether the Soviets would begin to attack again after the thaw period was over. They could, after all, wait to reinforce their grouping and see when their allies would actually open a second front on the continent. This strategy of waiting did not exclude a series of strikes in small forces to maintain their prestige and prevent the pullback of German forces from the east. For the Germans, this would have been most unpleasant. But it could lead to the fact that we, idly waiting in defence, would then have to fight a war on two fronts against strong opponents. For this reason, pure defence, a kind of positional warfare, was unacceptable to us. The second consideration that spoke against the use of purely defensive tactics was the simple fact that we did not have enough divisions available in the east for this purpose. The front from the Black Sea to the Arctic Ocean was too large for us to be able to create a solid defence on it, and least of all in the band of Group South, which had to defend then 32 divisions of the front from Taganrog on the Black Sea to the area southeast of Sumy, which was about 760 km. The ratio of forces allowed the Soviets, in the event that we were limited to pure defence, to conduct an offensive in various parts of the Eastern Front with superior forces and break through our front. As a result, the enemy would have achieved either the encirclement of stable sections of the front or our retreat. 1944 gave enough examples of what led us to the attempt to hold a stationary front. Consequently, we could not limit ourselves to pure defence. On the contrary, we had to bring into play, even if only within the framework of strategic defence, the factors that gave us an advantage over the enemy: more skillful leadership of troops, high combat qualities of troops, greater mobility of our troops. We had to, even if in general we would confine ourselves to defence, try to inflict powerful blows on the enemy in certain areas, as a result of which he would suffer significant losses, especially in prisoners, which could lead at least to a draw of the war. And as part of the strategic defence, we had to again conduct manoeuvre operations in them, lay our strength. This we could do when the advancing enemy gave us favourable chances to do so, or when we did it on our own initiative. Having in mind such a flexible management of operations, Army Group South already at the beginning of February 1944 entered with a petition to the Oak, that is, to Hitler. We did this in connection with the then planned large transfer of our forces from the right flank of the group to the left flank, but already planned further operations in the east. The exchange of views on this issue, coming mainly from our headquarters, continued until the end of March. Speaking in general terms, it was then a question of two alternatives. Either we were to give the initiative to the enemy, to wait for his offensive to then, having favourable prerequisites, to strike back. Or we had to try to retain the initiative and preempt the enemy with a blow before he recovered from the winter campaign. The solution of this question depended essentially on how to assess the anticipated enemy action after the end of the thaw period. Our retaliatory strike would be possible in view of the general situation only if the Soviets were ready to launch their offensive in the near future. The capabilities of the Soviet forces to carry out the operation. Although the possibility was not excluded that the Soviets would be passive until the opening of the Second Front by their allies, we still believed that the enemy after the end of the thaw would again begin his offensive. This was evidenced by his confidence, undoubtedly increased after the successes at Stalingrad. It was also psychologically difficult for the Soviet political leadership to make a big break in their repeatedly proclaimed liberation of the Holy Russian land. Finally, it had to be assumed that the master of the Kremlin was intent on getting ahead of his allies in Eastern Europe, above all in the Balkans. For these reasons we believed, and in this we found full support in the OK, that the enemy after the thaw would again begin his offensive. If this were to happen, the enemy, because of his numerical superiority, would have great opportunities. He could try to break through on the southern flank of the group north to push it to the sea, and then surround it. He could try to take in pincers from the north and south protruding near the Eagle far to the east of the ledge occupied by the group centre, in order thus to break the front of the entire group. Nowhere the enemy has not yet had such good operational, and at the same time great military, economic and political chances, as on the southern flank of the Eastern Front, on the section of the Group South. Here, the German front covering the Donbass protruded like a balcony far to the east, parallel to the northern coast of the Sea of Azov. If the enemy had attacked this balcony, From the east through the Mayas and from the north through the Donets, he could have pressed the German armies located in the Donbass to the coast and there destroy them. If he had supplemented these actions with an offensive in the Kharkov area in the direction of the Dnieper below Kiev, he could have achieved the goal that eluded him in the winter of 1942/43, the encirclement of the entire German southern flank on the coast of the Azov and Black Seas. He could then defeat not only Army Group South, but also located on the Cuban bridgehead Group O with its 17th Army. This victory on the southern flank of the Eastern Front would give into the hands of the Soviets at the same time and important in military-industrial terms Donbass and breadbasket of Ukraine. It would have opened to the enemy the way to the Balkans, primarily to Romanian oil. Finally, it could not but affect the political position of Turkey. Since the Soviets' offensive in any of the other sections of the front did not open such prospects, it was to be assumed that the main direction of their offensive operations, if they attacked at all, as in 1942 and 1943, would be on the southern flank of the Eastern Front. The forces at their disposal also did not exclude the possibility of local strikes on other parts of the front. These plans were evidenced by the grouping of enemy forces. In front of the front of Army Group South, only in the rear of the enemy stood 5 strong groups of operational reserves, saturated, primarily tank and cavalry corps. 1 group stood in front of our front on the Mayas, 2 in front of our front on the Middle Donets, and the other 2 east and northeast of Kharkov. In addition, the supply of forces from the Caucasus and from Stalingrad continued in March. Strong enemy reserves were also in front of the eastern and northern sections of the Ural Arc, where Army Group Center was located, as well as near Moscow. In general, the situation left no doubt that the enemy, sooner or later, will try to achieve decisive success in the section of Army Group South, and possibly also on the southern flank of Army Group Center, through an offensive to cover the Ural Arc. Therefore, the command of Army Group South expected that the enemy will first attack the Donetsk balcony from the east through the Mayas, and from the north through the Donets in its middle reaches, to restrain our armies there or push them to the coast. This offensive would then probably have to be supplemented by an offensive from the Kharkov area or northward toward the Dnieper River in order to repeat the broad sweeping operation that the enemy had failed in February-March. Since the summer of 1944, the Soviet command actually acted in this way. Retaliatory strike. On these alleged plans of the enemy was based our plan of retaliatory strike, which the command of the Group South repeatedly presented in February-March to Hitler. We proposed to withdraw and let the enemy's armies to the west approximately to the line Melitopol-Dnipropetrovsk. At the same time, we had to prepare large forces in the rear of the northern flank of the army group. These forces were to break the enemy advancing there, to strike from there to the southeast or south, in the deep flank of the enemy armies advancing through the Donbass on the lower Dnieper, and destroy them on the coast. In comparison with the German offensive of 1942, the main difference between this plan was the following. We intended to strike back after the enemy had introduced his offensive forces and partially exhausted them. The purpose of operations should not be territorial goals in the east, but the destruction of enemy troops on an important flank by encircling him near the coast of the Sea of Azov. In order to fulfill this plan, and to exclude the possibility of the enemy's retreat to the east, first we had to free him the way through Donbass to the lower Dnieper. Against this temptation he would hardly resist. If we had succeeded in this partial strike with a limited objective, we would have succeeded in destroying significant enemy forces, and we could have launched a second strike to the north against the enemy's central grouping. Of course, the prerequisites for such a counter-strike could have been created in other parts of the Eastern Front, but there it was possible to defeat the enemy only partially, and at this time the enemy himself would have sought a decisive victory in the south. In addition, only on the southern flank was it possible to use the sea as one part of the arc when encircling the enemy. To carry out this undoubtedly very risky retaliatory strike, 2 prerequisites were necessary. First, the German High Command had to be more definite than hitherto, to consider the main theatre of war the Eastern Theatre, and within it the southern flank. On the northern flank of the Group South, had to create a strong superiority over the supposed enemy forces there, if we were going to bring the operation to a successful end. For this purpose it was necessary, at all costs, to remove troops from the secondary theatres, even if there was a danger of difficulties. To strike in all theatres meant to question the success of even a partial strike in the east. It was necessary to borrow forces from Army Group Centre and North. At least there should have been created operational reserves, if necessary even by timely alignment of the front. Secondly, the German High Command should not have been afraid to create chances for the success of a retaliatory strike at the cost of giving up territory, in this case the Donbass. If it was not able to conduct an offensive with far-reaching goals by conducting maneuver battles, in which we were then superior to the enemy, it had to be ready to gain freedom of action through a systematic withdrawal. The territory of the conquered eastern regions gave ample scope for this. However, it turned out that Hitler did not intend to create neither the first nor the second prerequisite. Army Group South repeatedly most vigorously insisted to Hitler on the idea of making the direction of the main blow of the Eastern Front, and on it the southern flank. Theoretically, he agreed with this. In practice, however, he could never timely and sufficiently imbued with this plan, perhaps also because the Chief of the General Staff of the Land Army and the Chief of Staff of the operational leadership in this matter always represented different interests. But the General Command did not agree with the point of view of Group South, even with regard to the direction of the main strike on the southern flank of the Eastern Front. Although throughout 1944 it was quite clear that the enemy was looking for a solution to the war on the southern flank, still the Groups North and Centre were better staffed than the Group South, if you compare the ratio of their forces to the length of the front held by them, as well as the number of opposing enemy, except for the number of tanks. This is due to the mentioned by me negative attitude of Hitler to give anything voluntarily or to take risks in a secondary direction, and also because he did not want to take into account in advance the anticipated actions of the enemy. He chose the costly method of either giving very few forces where the outcome of the operation was to be decided, or giving them very late. But least of all, Hitler was ready to create an opportunity for great operational success in the spirit of the plan of the Group South by refusing, albeit temporarily, from the Donbass. At a meeting at the headquarters of the group in March in the city of Zaporozhye, he said that it is absolutely impossible to give the enemy Donbass even temporarily. If we lost this region, we would not be able to provide raw materials for our military industry. For the enemy, the loss of Donbass once meant a 25% reduction in steel production. As for Nikopol manganese, its importance for us cannot be expressed in words at all. The loss of Nikopol would mean the end of the war. Further, both Nikopol and Donbass cannot do without the power station in Zaporozhye. This point of view, the correctness of which we could not verify in detail, was of decisive importance to Hitler during the entire campaign of 1944. It led to the fact that our group never had the necessary freedom in the conduct of its operations, which would have allowed it to strike a superior enemy a truly effective blow or to gather sufficient forces on its important northern flank. Hitler did not agree with the idea that from voluntary withdrawal could be as successful, and often perhaps even more so, than in offensive operations, to move to decisive blows against the enemy. He disagreed with this idea because he considered the loss of territory, compared to the uncertain chance of victory, too great a risk. In this respect, he lacked courage or faith in his art of driving troops as well as in that of his generals. The preemptive strike. The plan of a retaliatory strike, as outlined by our army group, fell away therefore in view of the importance attached to the Donbass. As in other cases, the idea of such operations did not like Hitler for the reasons I have mentioned. True, we had to agree with him that in the spring of 1944, it was by no means clear whether the enemy would do us a favor, whether he would launch his offensive. If even the Western powers and demanded a Soviet offensive, Stalin could probably still wait. Inevitably, then, the idea of exploiting the enemy's weakness due to the defeats he suffered at the end of the winter campaign and striking him before he had fully recovered his combat readiness, especially his badly battered tank units, would then come to the fore. It would then be a question of a preemptive strike, albeit within the framework of a strategic defense. Since the thaw hindered all operations, various plans to organize a strike from the area southeast of Kharkov to break through the enemy's front on the middle reaches of the Donets River, based on exploiting the enemy's weakness, proved unfeasible. Thus, in the end, the Citadel plan was developed. While at the end of the winter campaign, as a result of victories in the area between the Donets and the Dnieper, as well as at Kharkov, was restored front from Taganrog along the Mayas and Donetsk to Belgorod, in the area north of Belgorod at the junction between the Group South. And the Group Centre remained occupied by enemy troops arc, extending far to the west. It covered the Kursk area, extending from Belgorod through Sumy and Rilsk to the area northeast of Oral. This arc, cutting into our front, was not just an inconvenient circumstance for us. It lengthened our front by almost 500 kilometers and required to hold it in the north, west and south of significant forces. It cut the railroads that led from the area of the Group Centre to Kharkov and were for us important communications behind the front line. Finally, this arc could serve the enemy as a starting point for the offensive, both on the northern flank of the Group South and on the southern flank of the Group Centre. It posed a particular danger in case it was decided to launch a counterattack from the Kharkov area against the Soviet forces advancing in the area of the Group South. The command of Army Group South therefore intended to eliminate this arc immediately after the battle for Kharkov, even before the beginning of the period of thawing in this area, taking advantage of the then weakness of the enemy. From this plan we had to abandon, because the Group Centre was not able to interact with us. No matter how weak the enemy was after his defeat at Kharkov, still the forces of Group South alone were not enough to eliminate this wide arc. Therefore now this arc became the target of the first preemptive strike. Above I have already talked about the operational importance of the Kursk arc. With a simultaneous offensive from the south and from the north, it was possible to cut off relatively large enemy forces in it, and then release significant German forces. But this goal, at least, so believed the command of the Group South, was by no means the only goal of the planned operation. On the contrary, it was clear that the enemy, in order to hold on to this important for him from an operational point of view, will soon throw into battle its operational reserves, standing in front of the northern flank of the Group South and the southern flank of the Group Centre. If we had conducted this strike in advance, that is, immediately after the end of the period of thawing, there would be hope that the enemy would be forced to throw into battle tank and mechanized corps of his army, not having finished their replenishment. This would give us the opportunity to count on the fact that we would have time to finish replenishing our formations earlier, and this would increase our chances. If it had been possible to defeat the enemy tank reserves in this battle, we would have been able to undertake a new strike either against the enemy's Donetsk front or in another area. This was, after all, as essential a goal of Operation Citadel as the much-needed elimination of the Kursk bulge. Plan of Operation Citadel. Operation Citadel was planned, therefore, with the aim of catching the enemy still in his stage of weakness. According to the instructions of the OK, the enemy troops on the arc around Kursk were to be cut off by the offensive of the Centre Group and the South Group, which were to pincer the arc at its base and destroy the enemy forces there. For both groups, this offensive posed a significant risk. The offensive of the Centre Group was to begin from the southern front of the Oral Arc. The section of the arc near Kursk was strongly wedged westward into our front, and north of it, the Oral section of the arc, held by the Group Centre, went far to the east into the enemy front. This arc, in accordance with the plan of Operation Citadel, gave the enemy the opportunity to launch an offensive with coverage, and in case of its success, also to threaten the rear of the troops of the Group Centre operating in Operation Citadel. In the area of Army Group South, the danger lay in the fact that it was necessary, at all costs, to hold Donbass, which its favourable location gave the enemy the opportunity to conduct an offensive with superior forces from two directions. Despite the doubts associated with this, both groups did everything to ensure the success of Operation Citadel with the highest possible concentration of forces. However, there was no doubt that the risk in the operations of these groups will be the greater the more time given to the enemy to regain their shattered forces. The Group Centre allocated for its offensive from the north of the 9th Army under the command of Colonel General Model. It had 3 tank corps with 6 tank, 2 motorized and 7 infantry divisions to break through in the direction of Kursk. These 3 corps were to start the offensive from the southern section of the Oral Arc and break through the enemy's front at a distance of 50 km, and both flank corps were to cover the strike wedge from the flanks with offensive actions. The breakthrough front was to be extended as far as possible by the offensive of both adjoining from the East and West Infantry Corps of the Army. They were also to provide the deep flanks of the breakthrough group. The offensive of the Ninth Army was to be supported by one air division from the Second Army, which closed the Kursk arc from the west and had on a front of 200 kilometers 9 weak infantry divisions, could hardly be expected anything more than attempts to shackle the enemy standing in front of its front to facilitate its encirclement by the advancing groups. Group South was able to allocate to the Operation Citadel large forces, namely 2 armies, which included 5 corps with 11 armoured and 7 infantry divisions. In the opinion of the Group Command, the decisive factor for the use of these armies was the fact that the enemy would soon after the start of the operation would throw into the battle his strong operational reserves, standing east and northeast of Kharkov. At least as important as the strike on Kursk to cut off the enemy forces there was the task of securing this strike from the east from the approaching enemy tank and mechanized formations by counterstrikes. The defeat of these forces was also an important objective of Operation Citadel. Army Group Kemp had the task of holding one infantry corps defense strip on the Donets from a point southeast of Kharkov to the area of Volchansk. Its tank and infantry corps were to provide active operations to breakthrough operations near Kursk to the east or northeast. To accomplish this task, this group was to launch an offensive from the Donetsk front in the section Volchanok-Belgorod in order to seize the infantry corps forces of the front facing east along Korocha, and its tank corps was to move northeast in the general direction of Skorodnoy. The other tank corps of 2 tank divisions, formerly in Army Group Reserve at first, was to be reassigned to Kemp's group after it had gained a sufficient area and secured freedom of action in a northeastern direction. Together with the aforementioned tank corps, they were to defeat suitable enemy tank formations in open ground combat. The 4th Tank Army under the command of Colonel General Goth was to make a breakthrough to Kursk towards the 9th Army and then destroy the enemy forces cut off west of Kursk. It had for this purpose 2 tank corps, numbering 6 tank divisions and 1 infantry division. In addition, another infantry corps was to join the offensive tank group on the western flank. If we managed to break through to Kursk and quickly destroy the units cut off there, the tank units of the 4th Tank Army would also take part in the defeat of suitable operational reserves of the enemy. It is clear that all the artillery of the RGK, which the group received from the OK and which it had on its site, was given to both armies. Despite this, the offensive support artillery was too weak to provide a breakthrough of the enemy defense system. Another of our weaknesses was that the breakthrough of enemy positions had to be carried out primarily by tank divisions, since the OK did not give additional infantry divisions for this purpose. The offensive of both armies was to support the 4th Air Fleet, with which our group has long successfully interacted. Unfortunately, its commander Field Marshal Richthofen, shortly before this offensive was transferred to Italy. The forces that had this fleet to support the offensive consisted of 3 air groups of dive bombers, 3 groups of attack aircraft and 3 or 4 groups of bombers. Army Group Command was forced to extremely weaken the rest of its defence front in order to allocate for the offensive the above forces. For the defence remained only the 6th Army on the boundary of the Mayas, 1 tank army and the already mentioned corps on the right flank of Kemp's group on the Donets. All this amounted to 21 divisions, which had to hold the front from Taganrog to Volchansk 630 kilometers long. As a reserve on this broad front, we had only 1 tank, 1 motorized and 1 infantry division. Army Group Command, however, believed that if we undertook a preemptive strike, it was necessary to do everything to achieve a complete and rapid success of the Operation Citadel. If we had succeeded in this strike, if the enemy troops cut off in the Kursk Bulge had been destroyed, and in addition, in this battle, a significant part of his operational reserves would have been defeated, then the first step would have been taken to achieve the much-desired draw of the war. Victory at Kursk would have given the Army Group the opportunity to end the crisis that had arisen in its section of the front. Finally, there was still the possibility, if necessary, to withdraw from the Donbass to the lower Dnieper, so that then after the victory at Kursk to set themselves the goal of the implementation of the operational plan, based on the proposal of the Army Group to retaliate. It was possible, however, to assume that such actions are unlikely to meet Hitler's approval. But, in any case, victory would once again return him and Donbass. The start of Operation Citadel was scheduled for the earliest possible date. The Group Command proposed to the OKs the beginning of May, believing that by that time the period of thawing would be over. In fact, Operation Citadel could begin around mid-May. After the winter fighting ended due to the beginning of the thaw, I was forced to take a leave of absence to have my tonsils operated on. The doctors hoped to suspend with this operation the cataract that had begun in me, although not yet explained by my age. At the front, I was replaced first by Colonel General Model, then Field Marshal Baron von Weichs, but on all major issues I kept in touch with the Group Command and the Chief of General Staff of the Land Army. On April 18th, I sent him a letter intended for Hitler, in which I once again expressed the view that it is now necessary to throw all forces for the success of the Operation Citadel, that the victory at Kursk will compensate us for all the temporary defeats in other parts of the front of the group. Further, I emphasized that the earlier we begin Operation Citadel, the less danger there would be of a major enemy counteroffensive in the Donbass. On May 4th, I wanted to return to my headquarters, since in the middle of May we should have expected the start of Operation Citadel at the latest, at the beginning of the third decade of the month. On May 3rd, my Chief of Staff, General Busse, arrived in Lignitz with the message that on May 4th we were summoned to Munich for a meeting with Hitler. The commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Kluge, Colonel General Guderian, and the Chief of the General Staff of the Air Force, Colonel General Jeshenek, were also summoned to this meeting. At this meeting, the following transpired. Colonel General Model, who was to lead the Operation Citadel on the northern flank, submitted a report to Hitler on the situation in his section of the front and his plans in this regard. Model enjoyed Hitler's special confidence after he had distinguished himself by his special energy and fortitude in the campaigns of 1941 and 1942, first as commander of a tank corps, and then as commander of the 9th Army during the heavy defensive battles of the Center Group. I knew Model well from the time he served with me in the 8th General Staff Office. He was responsible for monitoring and evaluating the development of technology in relation to the demands made on it by the General Staff. He was very useful in this position, acting like a pike in the pond with the carp of the Ministry's departments. He was later Chief of Staff of the 16th Army in Army Group A, where I in turn was Chief of Staff and was involved in the preparation of the Western Campaign. Model was undoubtedly a very capable staff officer. He possessed a clear mind and the ability to quickly assess the situation. He was of medium height, rather delicate than strong build, with thick black hair and lively eyes, whose gaze sometimes became penetrating. He gave the impression of a young and vigorous man, persistent and diligent in his work. His special quality was an extraordinary energy, sometimes even bordering on indiscretion. He combined this quality with confidence and the ability to express himself firmly. In his character, he was an optimist who did not recognize difficulties. These qualities, his enormous energy, and finally his desire to achieve good personal relations with the main figures of the regime impressed Hitler. It cannot be denied that in this behavior played a role in his vanity. But we can also assume that he was devoted to Hitler and the ideas of National Socialism by conviction. In relation to the regime, he was less critical than the vast majority of senior military leaders. But Model cannot still be counted among the few soldiers who were obedient to Hitler in everything. His views on military matters he firmly defended and before Hitler. In any case, Model was a brave soldier who did not spare his life and demanded it of his subordinates, although often in a rough form. He could often be seen at critical parts of his front. Thus, Model was a soldier in the spirit of Hitler. Model failed to reap the laurels of victory as the leader of any bold operation. He increasingly took on the role of the man whom Hitler placed at a threatened or shaken section of the front to restore the situation, and Model achieved much in the performance of these tasks. Hitler apparently thought that Model was a commander who did not brood over operations but stood firm when Model saw that the battle in the Kursk cauldron was lost. He committed suicide. He did it not in order, as many party figures did, to avoid responsibility, but because he could not survive the destruction of his army group. Colonel General Model, in his report to Hitler, clearly pointed out the difficulties that will face the offensive due to the need to overcome the heavily fortified system of enemy defences. In his arguments played a major role reports on the extraordinary strengthening of the enemy's anti-tank defences, especially due to the introduction of new anti-tank guns, against which our TIV tanks could not resist. For the breakthrough operation entrusted to him from the outset, he therefore demanded 6 days. Model's report clearly made a strong impression on Hitler. He began to fear that our offensive would not be carried out quickly, or at least so quickly, to successfully realize the encirclement of large enemy forces. After this report, he recognized the need to strengthen our tank units. He promised to transfer to us by June 10th a significant number of tanks type Tiger and Panther, assault guns, as well as a battalion of extra heavy tanks type Ferdinand. In addition, TIV tanks and assault guns were to receive additional shields to enhance armor protection so that they could withstand the new Soviet ATGMs. Overall, Hitler envisioned roughly doubling the number of our tanks. First, however, he wanted to hear the opinion of both commanders regarding the postponement of Operation Citadel. Both spoke out against it. This opinion was shared by the Chief of the General Staff, General Zeitzler. Field Marshal von Kluge, who clearly felt bypassed at this direct report model, said in his usual sharp form that the data model that the depth of the enemy's position reaches 20 kilometers, exaggerated. On the aerial photographs, in his opinion, were recorded only already ruined from previous battles' trenches. Then Field Marshal pointed out that if we delay further, we will lose the initiative. This could lead to the fact that we will be forced to withdraw units from the front citadel. Here he was probably referring primarily to the dangerous situation on the Oral Arc. I also opposed Hitler's proposed postponement for two reasons. That replenishment of tanks which we will receive will apparently be more than offset by the increase in tanks on the Soviet side. The monthly output of tanks amounted to at least 1,500 units from the enemy. In addition, further waiting would result in the Soviet units regaining their striking power after losses in the winter campaign and after recent defeats, which had greatly affected the morale and fighting qualities of the enemy formations. Finally, the consolidation of enemy positions will continue with increasing intensity. Hence, the postponement of the Operation Citadel also spoke against the fact that it would greatly increase the danger in the band of defense of the group. Now, the enemy is not yet ready for an offensive on the Donets and Mias, but in June he will be able to do so. I pointed out in particular that the solution of the whole question is determined to a large extent by the general situation. In the case of postponement of the Operation Citadel and the possible imminent loss of Tunisia, will create the danger that the beginning of the Operation Citadel will coincide with the landing of the enemy on the continent, and we will then be forced to fight on two fronts. No matter how tempting it was to further strengthen our tank units, still, in my opinion, it was necessary to adhere to the deadline. In case of postponement, the group will need, along with the increase in tanks, and increase the number of infantry divisions to overcome the enemy defense system. I ended my statement by saying that the Citadel will not be an easy venture, that it is necessary, however, to keep the scheduled date for the start of the operation, and like a rider, the first to carry his heart over the obstacle. This comparison, as it soon became clear to me, Hitler, who valued neither horses nor riders, could not approve. The Chief of the General Staff of the Air Force joined the opinion of both commanders, stating that from the point of view of aviation, postponement of the Operation Citadel does not provide any benefits. No substantial increase in the number of airplanes could be expected at the present time. He confirmed that the enemy, judging by the situation in the air, is planning a decisive offensive in the section of Army Group South. Colonel General Guderian proposed to concentrate all tank forces in one direction, either on the section of Army Group South or on the section of Army Group Center. Hitler then repeated once again his arguments in favor of postponement until June 10th. Regarding the increase in the number of tanks on both sides, he said that the numerical superiority of the Russians in tanks we will compensate for the technical superiority of the incoming additional Tigers, Panthers and Ferdinand. Divisions, however, he cannot give more divisions. Regarding the danger associated with the fact that in the event of postponement of the Operation Citadel, it could coincide with the invasion of the enemy on the continent, he noted that in connection with the arrival in the Mediterranean sea ships with anti-aircraft guns and light ferrying means we will be able to maintain the supply of Tunisia and therefore hold there. Even with the loss of Tunisia, the enemy would need 6 to 8 weeks to prepare a landing. Therefore, it will not happen in mid-June. In conclusion, Hitler said that he intended to think again about whether to carry out the Operation Citadel in time or to delay it, and released us to his headquarters. While we waited there for the password to begin deployment and advance to the initial areas, which due to the ongoing training of troops and for reasons of camouflage were located scattered deep in the rear area of the group. On May 11th came the order that Operation Citadel is postponed until mid-June. 2 days later, on May 13th, the last units of our African army capitulated at Cape Bon. The following weeks were filled with the preparation and replenishment of units destined for the offensive, as well as checking and strengthening our front defences on the Donets and Mayas. The tanks promised by Hitler also arrived, but not at the promised time. Thus, the Operation Citadel was postponed all the time until July approached. It was now 6 weeks since the surrender of our army in Tunisia. On a large scale, we conducted false manoeuvres to disguise the objectives of our operation. With the beginning of preparations for the Operation Citadel, such activities were to result in large movements of all motorized units not occupied at the beginning of the offensive in the direction of Donbass, where false preparations for the offensive were already underway. We even made models of tanks which we transported to Donbass to mislead the enemy air reconnaissance. During this period of expectation, but also at the same time increasing tension, continued a lively exchange of views between the command of the group and the OCON further changes in the situation, and whether at all necessary Operation Citadel in view of such a delay in its start. The transfer of the enemy's operational reserves closer to the front showed that their replenishment had apparently already been completed. If the enemy was still on the defensive, it was still clear that he was preparing an offensive on the Donets and Mayas front, and perhaps later in the area on both sides of Kharkov. The same was observed in front of the center group, where the enemy's offensive on the Oral Bulge was being prepared, and in other sections of the eastern front could be noted signs of an offensive being prepared. Whether the enemy would soon launch an offensive himself, or would wait for the opening of a second front, or whether he would launch a counter-offensive after the German offensive, all this was still unclear. The group command, in discussing the matter with the OK, kept pointing out the following. 1. Any further delay would complicate our offensive. 2. At the same time will increase the risk in the defence area of our group, especially on the Donetsk balcony, because our forces there cannot long withstand the advance of large enemy forces. 3. Despite this risk, in carrying out Operation Citadel everything, as before, depended on whether we would throw all our forces to achieve a quick and decisive success of this operation, for which it would be necessary, perhaps, to survive the crisis situation in Donbass, not excluding the possibility of withdrawal. We again emphasize that the enemy would seek this year a decisive victory over the South group, and that the group should therefore be strong on its northern flank, and in other areas retain freedom of action in the spirit of those proposals that we made in February and March regarding the tactics of maneuver operations and retaliatory strikes. In response to an inquiry from the Chief of the General Staff about how the Group Command in general now refers to the conduct of the Operation Citadel, I replied that Citadel, in any case, will be a difficult operation, which, if successful, will give the opportunity to strike other strikes, but will not release in the near future forces. The question whether Operation Citadel was now advisable could only be answered from the point of view of the general direction of the war effort. The operation was appropriate if for the near future, that is, until the fall, we refused to remove any forces from the Eastern Front. If we assume that the Western powers will not begin until the fall of large operations to land a sea landing, then Citadel is possible. Equally, it would be possible if we assume that the Western powers will land somewhere and then be defeated, but only if they are forced to leave their bridgehead. In this discussion, Group Command found that there was unanimity of opinion with the Chief of the General Staff and the Operations Directorate of the OKK. However, it was not possible to obtain a clear Hitler's position on these important operational questions. In the letter I sent in those days to the Chief of the General Staff, there was the following notable passage. Since a telephone conversation on all these important questions between the group and the OK is impossible due to the great distance involved, I consider it necessary either to establish closer personal communication or, due to the remoteness of the High Command, that to give appropriate operational freedom of action in the East. Intolerable is such a situation, when the commanders of army groups are informed about the general situation only by military bulletins, intolerable, furthermore, and the lack of any communication between the chiefs of the highest military authorities. If we consider now the situation at that time, we can say that the commanders of the army groups, in connection with the constant postponement of the start of the Operation Citadel, should have declared to the OK that this offensive had lost its meaning and should not be carried out. After all, the operation was planned with the expectation of striking the enemy as early as possible at a time when the enemy was still in a state of weakness. Gradually, these chances were decreasing all the time. As for me, I believed that the operation should be carried out for the following reasons. First, the abandonment of the Operation Citadel would have conditioned further waiting in the east, associated with the dangers associated with the expected opening of the second front. At the time, it seemed that the Soviets really did not want to rush the start of their offensive. Secondly, the command of Group South was, at any rate, convinced that our offensive would be, although difficult, but successful. We doubted rather in the question whether we would be able to repel the enemy offensive in the Donbass. But we were convinced that after the victory at Kursk we would be able to end the crisis in Donbass, and maybe we would achieve a great victory there. The fact that our opinion regarding the possible success of our Citadel offensive was not so wrong as it may seem now is proved by the course of the operation and the reasons that led to its failure. About this we will still talk. Conditions were somewhat different for the Center Group. Here the success of the enemy in the area of the Ural Arc would immediately affect the Citadel. Here it was impossible to carry out a withdrawal, as it was, after all, possible in the Donbass, because the Ural Arc was the initial area of the offensive of the Ninth Army. If, therefore, the command of Group Center could not confidently count on the successful repulsion of the expected enemy offensive on the Ural Arc in order to divert our forces, it had to reject the conduct of Operation Citadel, which was postponed until July. Since, according to our information, this did not happen, the command assumed that under all circumstances the Ural Arc will be held. Still waiting for a decision on whether Operation Citadel would be carried out or not, on the anniversary of the capture of Sevastopol, I was to fly to Bucharest to present Marshal Antonescu with a gold badge for the Crimean campaign. At the last moment the flight was postponed, because Hitler ordered all commanders of associations and corps commanders of the Land Army and Air Fleet taking part in the Operation Citadel to arrive on July 1st at his headquarters in East Prussia. At this meeting, where only Hitler made a report, he announced his final decision to launch Operation Citadel. The offensive was to begin on July 5th. In his report, Hitler first justified in detail the postponement of the operation. According to him, it was necessary in view of the then-made replenishment of units with personnel and equipment and strengthening of the participating in this operation of formations. These units are now fully manned. As for armament, for the first time we surpassed the Russians in the number of tanks. New, but not convincing in comparison with his previous arguments, was the assertion that the postponement was also necessary, not least because, at the early start of the operation, the Soviets' appeals for help could lead in a short time to a landing by the Western powers in the Mediterranean area. We could then do nothing to counteract this. We could not have relied on Italian resistance. The enemy would have found in the Balkans the support of the peoples. Now, this critical phase has been largely overcome. In Sardinia, Sicily, the Peloponnese and Crete we now have sufficient forces. It should be remembered that on May 4th, Hitler, to my instruction concerning the danger of an enemy landing, stated that we would be able to hold Tunisia, and that, even if this did not happen, the Western powers would need 6 to 8 weeks to begin the implementation of the landing. At that time, therefore, Hitler did not consider the possibility of a rapid intervention by the Western opponents at the request of the Soviets. From what Hitler now said, however, it followed that he, seeking to go everywhere for certain, at the cost of the loss of the African army, strengthened our forces in the Mediterranean area. He therefore did not see the need to do everything to achieve the success of Operation Citadel. This was also the position he took during the operation. He justified his decision to launch Operation Citadel correctly by the fact that we can no longer wait for the enemy to launch his offensive, perhaps only in the winter or after the opening of the second front. A rapid and complete success of the offensive is also desirable because of the impact it will have on our allies and on our homeland. After Hitler announced before all the top commanders his decision to launch the offensive now and justified the need for it from the point of view of the High Command, there was naturally no possibility of changing this decision not to mention the fact that we really could not wait any longer in the east. My attempt to achieve in the interests of the Operation Citadel return Field Marshal Richthofen to the command of the Second Air Fleet remained fruitless and led only to a sharp clash with Goering. The latter did not want to agree with how important was the personality of Richthofen as commander of air formations. It is worth mentioning some of Hitler's statements contained in his report, as they are very instructive, although not for the situation at the time, but rather for Hitler's way of thinking. In 1938, in 1939 and 1940 was much more dangerous. It was now a matter of defending Europe on its borders, hence also the Italian islands and the Balkans. It was impossible to give up either these areas or Donbass. In general, however, he was quite confident in the success of the operation. American newspapers determined the losses of the Soviet Union, including civilian losses from starvation, at 30 million people. The losses in people fit for military service, in his opinion, amounted to 12 to 14 million people. In view of such losses and the difficulty of food supplies, the enemy must falter, or, like China, fall into agony. If these arguments may have bolstered the confidence of his many listeners, his next statement was apparently approved by only a few. Hitler stated that promises must not now be made to the individual nations of the Soviet Union, because of the bad effect this would have on our soldiers. Our soldiers must know what they are fighting for, namely a living space for their children and grandchildren. In the First World War we made the mistake of not having a goal in mind. At the conclusion of his report, Hitler said that he had already told me personally once that Italy's decision of August 24, 1939 on neutrality had been sent to London earlier than to Berlin. Only this decision made it possible for the British government to induce France to enter the war. The deployment of forces for Operation Citadel and the last great measures to mislead the enemy in our section had now begun. On July 3rd, I personally handed over at Bucharest the token for the Crimean campaign. This act was to help disguise by my visit to Bucharest the immediately imminent beginning of the offensive. On the evening of July 3rd, I was again already at my headquarters.